sometimes it's baffling how FDA chooses who gets a warning letter and who gets a raid.
I created Species Nutrition with one mission in mind: to provide bodybuilders and serious athletes with no-nonsense supplements that work. I put my name and reputation on every bottle of Species Nutrition products. If you want to be your absolute best, join the evolution. Dave Palumbo here with an RX Muscle news update. If you guys love your peptides, you're going to want to watch this little interview I have with my good friend and legal muscle expert, Rick Collins. Welcome back to the show.
Great to see you, Dave. Thank you.
Yes, you know, whenever these little announcements are made, Rick, I start trembling and I say, I got to get Rick Collins on because I got to find, you know what it is? Because there's so much misinformation that's put out. And people make up their own stuff and their own interpretations of laws. And so I go to the source when I want clarification. You clarified with the Anavar.
Right. I remember that. Yep. And the whole TRT, that's the end of testosterone. Right. And so,
they're still carrying on about that they think that's happening.
Right.
Yeah. But peptides. Now, I'm going to preface before I let you do your spiel. Rick and I have had discussions about peptides in the past because they've been around for a long time now. And you're and Rick, I hate to say it, Rick is always right. I said, Rick, what's the status of these things? What's the legal status? He's like, they're unapproved drugs. And he said, eventually they're going to crack down on these things and they're not going to be made available again. And once again, you're right. Tell us what's going on now here.
So, yes, you and I have had many conversations about peptides through the years, even going back to before peptides were even part of any kind of medical treatment or within any kind of clinic aspect. I mean, back to when it was just the research chemical market. So, so now, you know, we've got this new statement. It's a guidance from FDA, which came out September 29th, and it was entitled Safety Risks Associated with Certain Bulk Drug Substances Nominated for Use in Compounding. You got it up on the screen there. Yeah. So basically, what FDA has said in this new guidance is that it's looked at a long list of something like 28 or so peptide compounds, and none of them are the ingredients in an approved drug product. And so FDA has come out and looked at them and said that these things should be classified as category 2 substances because we don't know the safety profile, significant safety risks. I'll give you one example. So two of them that you know a lot of people may be interested in are BPC 157 and TB 500, as I'm sure you've covered in your show before regularly. People have been using it medically prescribed or through research chemical companies for various injuries and rehab of a muscle or soft tissue kind of issues. So I'll give you the example of what FDA says about BPC 157. They write, and this is a quote, FDA has identified no or only limited safety-related information for proposed routes of administration. Thus, we lack sufficient information to know whether the drug would cause harm when administered to humans. And so for that reason, and similar reasons with respect to the other compounds as well, their position is that if we don't know it's safe, well, then we shouldn't be compounding it for people to use.
Right. So what would happen to you if you were caught selling this? I mean, what category of crime are we talking about, here?
So I guess the first distinction should be selling it from kind of from a black market or website
Right.
or a research chemical site, or in the context of, let's say, a medical clinic. Because I know
Right.
there are medical clinics now
Yeah.
where physicians are
Prescribing it.
convinced that the safety risks are not sufficiently great to prevent prescribing it, and that they believe it's in the best interest of patients who've suffered whatever kind of muscle tears or other injuries.
Right.
And so those are kind of two different things, right? So in the context of medical prescribing, as you know, FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine.
Right.
That's not what FDA does. Deals with drugs, but not how practitioners prescribe. So there's some leeway, arguably, in that aspect. The problem is that FDA does deal with drugs, right? And
Right.
so when somebody wants to bring a drug to market, what do? Let's say Dave Palumbo has hundreds of millions of dollars and wants to bring his new great drug to market. So he speaks to FDA, he does a new drug application to be able to bring it to market. And then Dave does various tests, phase 1, 2, 3, clinical trials. The
Right.
deal.
Yeah.
These are all very, very expensive. It's a long, expensive process. Ultimately, Dave shows all of this information to FDA, and FDA says, okay, we're convinced safety and efficacy is established, and so we're going to give you this approval for your drug. If you're smart, you patent that drug. So of course, now you're going to make a lot of money and make back all those hundreds of millions of dollars that you spent in that process, right? That's the contract. That's the contractual understanding, in essence, between FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. So the pharmaceutical industry wants to make money. FDA, at least in theory, is tasked with the job of protecting public health. And so that's the process that is established for those drugs to come to market.
Gotcha.
So if you've got doctors prescribing compounds that have not gone through that process, right? So from FDA's standpoint, looking at this in the light most favorable to FDA, right? First.
Right.
So from their perspective, how do we know it's safe? How do we know it's effective? What do we know about it? Show me the phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials. Everything that Dave Palumbo's big pharmaceutical company would have to do to bring it to market, all those millions and millions of dollars, you're now sort of just introducing it to patients without that process.
And you know what, Rick? They're not really wrong. When I don't like what they're doing, because obviously we know that the compound works. But they're not wrong. There is no safety trials with these drugs.
So you could imagine why, if you're Dave Palumbo's pharmaceutical company, and now you spend all of that money to bring your drug product to market, and now you're looking at a compounding pharmacy that is effectively making a product and distributing it through physicians without spending a penny toward that approval process, you're going to go to FDA and say, are you kidding me? Why am I spending hundreds of millions of dollars to bring my product to market, and you're going to let this guy just bring products to market without even going through that approval process? So I think that, I know people are upset about it, but when you think about it in those terms, at least you can understand how FDA sees its role.
How come BPC 157 was never targeted by like a drug company to bring to market?
I think the decisions of what drugs come to market are based on, cost effective. They look at what is it going to cost to bring a drug to market, which is huge amount.
Right.
And then how much money are they going to make out of it? I think Big Pharma generally kind of is hesitant about injectable drugs. A lot of people don't like injectable drugs.
Right. But BPC is also orally absorbable, from what I understand,
I mean, I don't know what the study. All of this is kind of anecdotal,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I know.
it's an anecdotal. It's bro science.
It's bro. I was gonna say it's a locker room discussion.
Yeah, it's funny. I just wrote a column for muscular development about bro science, and the question was bro science right all along? And when you really look at some of the things, the value of testosterone as a hormone, the value of a high protein diet, which was, if you ask any registered dietitian, your kidneys are going to fall out. This is a terrible thing, right? All of those the importance of resistance training over cardio. I remember years ago, you come from the cardio, from the runner's background, but I remember years ago when I was a young guy and I was training, I was competing in bodybuilding at the time. And the internist, I went for my annual checkup, and the internist was like, why are you doing this? You've got to stop this lifting weights. It's no good for you. All you need to do is run. The guy weighed like 130 pounds. But that's, when you talk about pro science, there's, of course, bodybuilders tend to bring everything to the extreme, right? So you're bringing it to a point where you hit that bell curve, and now you're on the other side of it. And maybe that's, as we've seen with all of these things, there could be too much of a good thing.
Right. The interesting thing, though, Rick, is that the peptides that seem to mimic or be the same compound as the prescription drugs, like semaglutide, which is Ozempic essentially, right? Mm-hmm. And IGF-1, which is, Increlex, those are still being allowed to be compounded, correct?
So this list is only really addressing, as I read it, the sorts of compounds that are not already approved drugs. Right. So you see like melanotan 2 is on here.
I saw that.
Melanotan 2 was studied. It went through, I think, phase 1 clinical trials. You may remember, maybe it was phase 2 out in Arizona, I think. And then there were some side effects, so they discontinued it. Again, injectable drugs, I think, very often are less attractive to big pharma. Big pharma wants a pill that you have to take every day for the rest of your life, right? That's the value. If you can get some new statin that people are going to have to use every day until they die, you're going to recoup all your investment, which is substantial. It's funny. I just saw this month a warning letter went out to a website that was selling these essentially semaglutide products, and it's interesting, and we could talk about this another time, but sometimes it's baffling how FDA chooses who gets a warning letter and who gets a raid, right?
Because, I was going to ask you that,
I've been doing this for 30 years, and it's almost impossible to tell. I look at some of these warning letters, and it's like FDA is explaining why they're breaking the law, and yet somebody else gets no warning letter whatsoever, and FDA OCI shows up with a search warrant, and suddenly there's a U.S. attorney involved, and somebody's on the phone screaming, "Rick, help!" So
I can guarantee if I sold peptides, I would get they wouldn't even give me the letter; they would just show up, and I'd be calling you.
Yeah. So to me, the justice system requires some uniformity and enforcement of law. You can't treat people doing the same thing completely differently.
But you said it to me, and you're right. It's impossible to go after everyone. So they go after the people who they want to make an example of, I guess.
Sometimes, I mean, how somebody gets on the radar screen can be completely random. I've seen small fish that wind up on the radar screen, and the big fish are never hooked. It's very weird. Sometimes it's somebody makes a phone call. Some mom, discovers a peptide in her son's on her son's dresser, and is like, maybe he got sick, or he's home with a cold, and she's thinking this is what did it, and so she drops it. She makes a phone call to FDA, and suddenly they're on the radar screen.
So what are people facing? First of all, I'm pretty sure that most of the reputable hormone replacement clinics will stop selling these peptides, because obviously they don't want to put themselves in legal jeopardy. I'm sure there will be a few renegades that continue to do, but by and far, we're going to probably see mostly these for research only peptide sites, which we know are, they're out of their minds doing that. We'll continue to sell it. What if the FDA gets something up their butt about a certain site and they get reported? What are these guys facing? Like, what are they going to call Rick Collins to help them save them? Are they going to go to jail for this? Are they going to get fined? What do you think is the
So the compounding, some of them have already said they're going to discontinue. They're pulling the plug. Some of it is as of November 1st. Some they're already done. Others are going to wait because this is a guidance, right? This isn't law. What FDA says is not in the U.S. code. It's not a statute. It's simply how they view things. But of course, how they view things can affect how they enforce. And so, their position is that if you're introducing something that's not an approved drug into interstate commerce, well, that's a violation. That's a criminal offense under the U.S. code. So, that's an issue for these companies that continue to do it. If they all stop, and you and I have talked about this, demand begets supply, right? Just because you stop a legitimate source of supply doesn't mean that suddenly nobody wants that anymore. I mean, the reality is you just drive it underground. So I've represented, as you know, a lot of underground labs and a lot of research chemical companies that were selling peptides, SARMs, ancillary drugs, erectile dysfunction drugs, etc., all with the disclaimer that they're for research purposes only. And the FDA and the Department of Justice, they don't buy that. They look at the facts that would essentially undermine that claim, right? So you're claiming it's for research, but you're giving dosing information. You're corresponding with customers who at emails like youngandjacked at gmail.com. You're shipping it to college dorms. You're advertising it in ways on bodybuilding sites. So obviously you're kind of making it clear that this is a ruse. And the position of the FDA and Department of Justice is that ruse is fraud. That it's essentially you're fraudulently claiming it's for research when it's not for research, and your purpose in doing that is to prevent the FDA from recognizing that this is a drug transaction, drug in the sense of something that's affecting the structure and function of the body, not like a controlled substance, but that it's a drug. You should be a pharmacist. You should be involved. You should be a doctor. You shouldn't be on a www.peptideswhatever.com. So I've seen people charged with that. I've represented many. I've been very successful in my defense of keeping people out of prison on this, at least, but you know what they always say, past results don't guarantee future outcomes, number one. And number two, nothing I say in these sorts of interviews is to be deemed, attorney-client advice in any way, or to create an attorney-client relationship by watching the video. But the bottom line is I do think that a lot of this will be driven underground. I think that the demand will make people want to, you say it'd be crazy to do it. I have no doubt that more people will jump onto the bandwagon of selling peptides, for research. Maybe they'll try to skate and not make claims or cut off email correspondences, never give dosing. They'll try to minimize their chances of getting caught. I don't recommend anybody do it, obviously, because I've represented people and seen them get in big trouble for it.
But what's the status of the drug? Is it still the same status, or are they just recommending you don't sell it? Or I mean, what has changed in terms of the legality of it? Was melanotan ever legal or BPC? I don't know.
No. There's really no. This memorializes. It's almost like a warning letter in a sense. It memorializes with specificity that the FDA has identified these things as not being safe to compound. So it's sort of a message to the compounding. But separate and apart from that, none of these things are approved, as drugs. And so they are unapproved drugs. And the law has said for many years that if Dave Palumbo introduces unapproved drugs into interstate commerce, that's what gives federal jurisdiction, with the intent to defraud or mislead. And that would be like calling them research chemicals when they're really not. Well, that's a violation of the law. And the intent to defraud and mislead is what makes it a felony. It gets complicated to say, what are people facing?
And fraud sometimes can be worse than having a couple of vials of anabolic steroids around, right?
It's 100%. It's funny because interestingly, the sentencing, the guidelines, the federal sentencing guidelines that affect how much time am I looking at? Well, the U.S. sentencing guidelines in a federal case will say what you're looking at. And with respect to any kind of fraud case, you look at something called the fraud table, which corresponds to the amount of money of the loss. In other words, really the gain of what you made. So if you sell $10,000 worth of peptides, you're pretty low. You're not facing anything insane in terms of a sentence. You sell $3 million. And I've represented clients on multi-million-dollar peptide and research chemical cases. And so now you're looking at a guideline level much higher. I've got an arsenal of tools that where I kind of fight back and forth on what guidelines are appropriate and whether the loss guidelines even apply in the first place. But nobody wants to be on the receiving end of an indictment or a federal information. It's not fun. I keep my fees reasonable, but look, you're going to pay. There's no question about it. And you're going to pay the government because the government is going to look to recoup what you made $3 million. They're going to try to get you to forfeit every penny. Right. So, now on the other hand, would I say that most of the companies are getting caught? Probably not. Like you said before, FDA is understaffed. There's not enough resources to go after everybody, so they have to pick and choose, right? They have to make an example out of some. The vast majority, it's like speeding, right? People are going over 65 all the time. Sure. Some get caught. Probably the majority never will get caught. No. But you're speeding, taking the chance to go speeding is one thing. Taking the chance to sell something that the feds can get involved with as a criminal case, it's a higher, you have to make an assessment. What's your risk tolerance, right? So people make that assessment.
They only make it usually once, though.
Well, there are some repeat customers. There are some,
I know you. Unfortunately, you do have
very high risk tolerant people.
Oh my! So what? All right. So basically, what the status of the drugs haven't changed, but the recommendations of the compounding pharmacy. So any real legitimate compounding pharmacy is not going to make these things anymore because they're going to be too scared. Obviously,
I would think many of the compounding pharmacies will. Some may be waiting to see something more formal in the Federal Register or something like that. But I think most of the compounding pharmacies see the handwriting on the wall. There's other issues in terms of prescribing unapproved drugs too, from a physician standpoint, I would guess. I mean, if you had finished medical school and you were Dr. Dave Palumbo and you were prescribing, BPC 157, let's say, you'd look at your malpractice insurance policy, right? And if you told the insurance carrier that, I don't know what they would say. I've seen some policies where they specifically exclude unapproved drugs from coverage.
Look, when you own a supplement company, a lot of these insurance, these indemnity insurance companies won't cover certain nutritional supplements that are legal.
Right.
Like if you sell this product, we will not insure you,
So bottom line is, if you are in the clinic or physician space, you should read your policy and see what you're covered for and what you're not before you prescribe something that is not an approved drug. The only other thing I'd say before we finish, though, is we've explained why FDA is doing this. We've explained that there's some rationale to it, but let's look at what the ultimate effect is going to be. because it's similar to what happened with anabolic steroids in 1990, right? In 1990, Congress passed a law, made steroids a controlled substance. In 1991, it took effect. What happened? You had the big pharmaceutical companies getting out of the business. It's controlled now. They don't want to touch it. You had ordinary pharmacists, pharmacies everywhere. They have no stock to carry. You have physicians now saying, I don't want to be involved in this. This is a controlled substance. It's like Vicodin. I don't want to be involved in this. And so what happens again if there's a demand and no legitimate supply? It's black market, right? I mean, it's so the black market ballooned in the aftermath of the Anabolic Steroid Control Act. And when you have a ballooning black market, you really do remove a lot of the controls and safety mechanisms that prevent some of the harms, right? I mean, so when pharmaceutical companies are making the products, you know that they're made in a GMP compliant laboratory, and there's going to be all sorts of quality control mechanisms in place. And the pharmacist is going to be there as a part of the triad of what's going on. And then the doctor is screening you. You may have some contraindications. I shouldn't give you this drug. Or, let me give it to you in doses and let me advise you and monitor you, make sure that your blood pressure doesn't creep up, whatever it is. So all of that goes out the window when you remove the legitimate source of supply. And I think that's unfortunately what we keep doing with some of these things. So while I understand the rationale, let's be prepared for what the fallout is, because people who like peptides are not going to now say, well, forget it. I'm not going to use, these when I get my next injury. They're going to go to the black market. And, and I've represented a lot of people who have sold research chemicals. I've defended them in criminal matters. Some of them were meticulous in their quality control and the product, very proud of their products. But I got to tell you, Dave, some of them were not. Some of them, the idea that somebody's injecting what was this guy made in his kitchen, and I've seen the kitchen, I've seen what's going on, and it's terrifying. So when we look at harm reduction policy, and I think that should underlie a lot of what FDA and what our society should do, is reduce the harms so that people don't get hurt. You minimize people getting hurt. When you
Plus, we don't even know what we're getting a lot of times, Rick. I mean, our good friend Bruce Neller said he's convinced that everything coming out of China that they say is GH releasing peptides is actually GH.
He said that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I had a client who had gotten finished peptides from China. There were green caps on some of the bottles and blue caps. Green caps was one peptide, blue caps was another. In his stupor, he forgot which was which. And so people thinking they're getting one peptide or getting a different peptide. And he was well-meaning about it. It was like, oops, my bad, But so that wouldn't happen, hopefully, in, when you've got more controls involved.
Right. So, all right, one more thing before I let you, because I know you got a lot to do. USADA severing ties, U.S. Anti-Doping Agency severing ties with UFC. What was that about?
So, I mean, everybody's saying Conor McGregor, right? I mean, I've heard this, the whole, who knows, if you remember, I dealt with Jeff Nowitzki, who now is sort of the guru for UFC drug testing. Back when he was just a field,
he was a agent. CPA, wasn't he?
He was originally IRS, and then he went to work for FDA in the aftermath of the Balco case. And I got along with him, and I still, in fact, I on his LinkedIn, he was posting looking for somebody to administer UFC's, get involved more with UFC's new post USADA drug testing. And I said, haven't talked in a while. We should chat about this.
That's funny.
It's going to be interesting to see. I think the last time I was on, I may have mentioned as well that guy Aaron D'Souza, the Australian businessman, is now promoting that. I haven't heard too much about it lately, but supposedly in December of 2024 there will be a no drug testing Olympics. So they're calling it the enhanced games. Use what you want. Use as much as you want, or don't use. It's totally on you, and so we're not going to test. and we're going to let the best person win. And that's going to be interesting to see.
But why did the UFC get rid of USADA? They just don't want to be bothered. I heard that they were a pain in the neck. They would come to people's houses 5 a.m. before.
I've heard that they were overly aggressive and that they're looking to do their own thing. I saw the statement by Travis Tygart of USADA. I don't know whether it was blindsided by it or whatever, but I don't think. I think that UFC will replace something. That there'll be a program put in place. Whether it will be as rigorous, whether people are going to be woken up at 5 a.m. or not, probably not.
Yeah, I think it'll probably be a lot less vigorous. I don't think does anyone care if these guys are taking drugs? It's not an Olympic sport. I mean, right?
Yeah, I've heard both sides of that argument. I've heard who cares. I've also heard the argument that an enhanced athlete in a contact sport of where head injuries are possible, that you've got potentially a bigger sledgehammer to hit into somebody's skull. I mean, you've heard those same arguments.
If you're worried about that, you shouldn't be fighting. You shouldn't be fighting to begin with.
It's a point.
Tyson didn't need any steroids to hurt people with his hands.
No, I don't think either of us would want to jump into that ring with him.
No. But anyway, well, Rick, as always, I love having you on. Any excuse to get you on, talk shop. It's always fun. And I think a lot of people think, and initially I thought until I actually started reading everything that they were basically making these peptides controlled substances, but they're really not.
No,
they're just, making recommendations to the compounding pharmacies not to make these things anymore. And we'll see where it goes. But I suspect you're right. We're going to see a lot more go to these underground peptides.
No question.
Yeah.
And I did see something just by way of information. I saw somebody posted something about the SARMS Control Act of 2019, which, if you remember, there was, unlike this, there was an actual push by Congress to make SARMs into Schedule 3 controlled substances. Right. Somebody just posted that they were Schedule 3. They're not. That didn't go anywhere. That stalled in Congress. So SARMs are not Schedule 3.
Isn't it hard to make a SARM Schedule 3 when it's not even an approved drug in this country?
Well, I guess you could argue Congress can do what it wants. I mean, look what it did with steroids, right?
That's true.
Back in the day, in order to be a controlled substance in the first place, you've got to show a potential for addiction and dependency.
Right.
Back then, there was like some hypothetical theory of steroid addiction that existed. Some guy wrote an article and Congress used that to justify it,
And then Biden spearheaded that whole thing, right?
So he did. So Biden spearheaded, he was one of the main loudest voices in Congress to criminalize steroids because of the potential performance enhancement in sports. I mean, that's really what it was.
Who could use them more than anyone right now? He could use a good dose of testosterone. That's Rick, I love you, man. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, brother. Always fun.
All right, guys, that's going to take us to the end of another episode of RX Muscles News Update. I'm Dave Palumbo with Rick Collins. We'll see you next time.